The rope creaked in the bitter wind, swaying against a sky heavy with snow clouds. Jackson Blackwood stood motionless on the wooden platform, his breath forming small clouds that disappeared into the frigid Montana air. The hemp noose hung loose around his neck, the rough fibers scratching against his skin with each gust. Below him, the citizens of Redemption gathered in the town square, collars pulled high against the cold, their faces grim beneath the brims of hats and bonnets. There were no cheers, no jeers, just the solemn quiet of justice being served in a land where survival itself was hard won. Sheriff Thomas Holt adjusted his gloves, his weathered face betraying no emotion as he gripped the lever that would drop the trapdoor beneath Jackson's feet. The local newspaper editor scribbled notes with a pencil gone dull, documenting another frontier hanging for the weekly edition. "Jackson Blackwood," the sheriff announced, his voice carrying across the square. "You have been found guilty of theft from the town stores and resisting lawful arrest. The penalty, as prescribed by territorial law, is death by hanging. Have you any final words?" Jackson's eyes remained fixed on the distant mountains, their peaks disappearing into the low-hanging clouds. Somewhere up there, in a cave warmed by a small fire, his boys waited. Matthew and Daniel, 8 and 6, waiting for a father who wouldn't return. The thought was a physical blow, harder than any fist, a pain so sharp it stole the air from his lungs. He had failed them. In the end, that was his only crime, and the only one that mattered. "I've nothing to say," Jackson replied, his voice raw but steady. "Let's be done with it." Sheriff Holt nodded, his hand tightening on the lever. The crowd leaned forward, that instinctive, morbid human reaction to witness the moment life leaves a body. "Stop!" The voice cut through the silence like an axe splitting wood. It was female, sharp with an authority that was utterly out of place in the grim tableau. Heads turned, the crowd parting as a woman pushed her way through, her cloak a slash of expensive, dark wool against the snow-dusted ground. Jackson's gaze finally broke from the mountains. He saw her then, a figure of impossible contrast. She was younger than he'd expected, her face framed by a bonnet of fine black silk, showing a profile that was severe and beautiful in equal measure. But what stunned him, what stunned the entire town into silence, was the pronounced swell of her belly beneath the cloak. She was heavily with child. "You cannot hang this man," she declared, reaching the front of the crowd, her breath coming in slight pants from the exertion. Her eyes, the color of dark, still water, were fixed on the sheriff. Sheriff Holt's hand remained on the lever, but his brow furrowed in confusion. "Ma'am, this is a lawful execution. Please step back. I invoke the Frontier Labor Act of 1871, she announced, her voice unwavering. She held up a folded document, the paper crisp and official. "This man can serve his sentence through indentured labor rather than hanging?" Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Jackson's heart, which had been a dull, resigned thud, gave a painful lurch. Hope was a crueler torment than any news. "That law is for debtors, not thieves," Sheriff Holt countered, though a flicker of uncertainty had entered his voice. Section 4, Paragraph 3, the woman recited from memory, her voice cutting through the rising wind, extends the provision to non-violent criminals during times of territorial need, with the signature of a territorial magistrate and upon the petition of a citizen of standing. She took a step forward, extending the document. "I am Eleanor Hayes. My late husband was James Hayes. My homestead is the largest in this valley. I am with child and have no one to work the land or maintain the property. The magistrate in Pine Creek has affirmed my petition. This is legal and binding." The sheriff reluctantly descended from the platform, his boots thudding on the hard-packed earth. He took the document with a skeptical frown, his lips moving as he read. The silence stretched, broken only by the whistling wind. Jackson watched the woman, Eleanor Hayes. She stood with her back ramrod straight, one hand resting almost unconsciously on her swollen belly. She had not glanced at him once. Her focus was entirely on the sheriff, her expression that of a general directing a battle. "It appears to be in order," Holt admitted finally, his voice thick with grudging disbelief. "Then remove the noose from his neck," Eleanor Hayes commanded. The crowd watched in stunned silence as the deputy, a boy barely out of his teens, fumbled with the knot at Jackson's neck. When the rope came free, his skin burned where the hemp had been. When his boots hit the ground of the town square, his legs nearly buckled beneath him. The sudden, shocking return of a future he had already surrendered was a dizzying, nauseating thing. Eleanor approached him, her voice low enough that only he could hear. If you run, they will hunt you down and hang you anyway. Your only chance is with me. Jackson studied her face, searching for a hint of mercy, a flicker of compassion. He found none. Her eyes were like polished stones, her expression a mask of cold, practical resolve. This was not an act of charity. It was a transaction. He gave an almost imperceptible nod. Mrs. Hayes, Sheriff Holt said, handing back the document. He's your responsibility now. If he causes any trouble, if he so much as steps off your property without your written consent, it'll be on your head. And the rope is still waiting. I understand, Eleanor said, tucking the paper inside her cloak. As they walked away from the gallows, the crowd parted for them as if for a leper and his keeper. Jackson felt their stares like a physical weight on his back. He had been prepared to die. Now he found himself following a pregnant stranger toward an unknown, and perhaps more terrifying, future. Neither spoke until they reached a sturdy wagon at the edge of town, a fine bay mare already harnessed and waiting. Eleanor climbed awkwardly onto the bench, gathering the reins. Get in, she said, her gaze fixed on the road ahead. Jackson hesitated for only a breath before climbing up beside her. The wagon lurched forward, leaving redemption and the shadow of the gallows behind. As the last buildings of the town receded, he finally spoke, the words tearing from his throat. My sons. Eleanor's gaze didn't waver from the road. I know about your sons, she said, her voice flat. They are the reason I am here. The statement, so matter-of-fact and yet so deeply mysterious, hung in the frigid air between them. Jackson stared at her profile, at the woman who had bought his life for reasons he could not begin to fathom. The gallows had been a simple end. This, he suspected, was the beginning of something far more complicated. The silence in the wagon was a third passenger, heavy and cold. The vast, empty landscape stretched on all sides, a prison without walls, mirroring the desolation in Jackson's soul. He was a passenger in his own life, his every breath owned by the impassive woman beside him. Eleanor Hayes kept her gaze fixed on the horizon, her hands sure and steady on the reins. She handled the wagon with a competence that was unnerving, a silent demonstration of her control over him, over the horse, over this entire, impossible situation. Every jolt of the wheels was a torment, a tick of a clock counting down the moments his sons had left. Matthew, Daniel, hold on, just hold on. They arrived at her estate as the sun began to dip low, painting the clouds in hues of bruised purple and blood orange. The homestead was impressive. A large, two-story house of sturdy timber, a massive barn, and well-maintained fences stretching farther than the eye could see. But it was lifeless. No smoke curled from the chimney. No dog barked a greeting. No signs of life stirred behind the clean, curtained windows. The air smelled of pine and dust, not of cooking or wood smoke. It was a house, not a home. A perfect, silent monument to grief. You will work the land, Eleanor said as she led him inside, her voice echoing slightly in the unnervingly tidy main room. There is a guest room for you and your sons. You will not leave this property without my written permission. The words, so calmly delivered, were chains. My boys are starving, Jackson said, his voice a low growl of desperation. I have to get to them. Tonight. No. Her refusal was absolute, as unyielding as the stone of the fireplace. You are my property now, Mr. Blackwood. Your life is my asset. I will not risk it on a reckless journey in the dark. She saw the rebellion flash in his eyes and added, her voice dropping to a chillingly practical tone. Your sons are your leash. You will do as I say, or they will pay the price for your disobedience. We will leave at first light. I will accompany you to ensure you return. The journey into the mountains the next morning was arduous. The trail narrowed, becoming treacherous, but Eleanor navigated it with a skill that surprised him. She was no fragile city widow. There was a core of tempered steel beneath her refined exterior. When they finally reached the hidden cave, Jackson's heart hammered against his ribs. He scrambled from his horse, calling their names. He found them huddled together under a single, threadbare blanket, the fire a pile of cold ash. Daniel was barely conscious, his small face pale and still. Matthew, gaunt but fierce, had his arms wrapped around his younger brother, a tiny, half-eaten strip of jerky clutched in his hand. He had saved the last of their food for Daniel. Pup, Matthew whispered, his eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and profound relief. Jackson fell to his knees, gathering his sons into an embrace so tight he feared he might break their fragile bodies. The scent of pine smoke and desperation clung to them. He held them, rocking back and forth, the dam of his control finally breaking his silence. Scalding tears streamed down his face. Daniel stirred, his eyes fluttering open. "You came back," he murmured, his voice a dry rasp. "I came back," Jackson choked out. "I'll always come back." Eleanor remained at the mouth of the cave, a silent observer. Her presence was a cold weight that kept the reunion from being wholly pure, a constant reminder of the price of their survival. The arrival of the boys shattered the sterile quiet of Eleanor's house. Their small, shuffling footsteps on the polished floorboards, Daniel's occasional weak cough, Matthew's whispered questions. Each sound was an intrusion, a violation of the tomb-like silence. They brought with them the scent of the wild, of wood smoke and earth, displacing the sterile air of beeswax and sorrow. That night, after he had settled the boys in a warm bed and watched them fall into an exhausted, food-filled sleep, Jackson found Eleanor waiting for him by the fire in the main room. The lamp cast long, dancing shadows on the walls. "They are safe now," she said. "It was not a comfort, but a statement of fact. And you were in my debt. I'll work until my hands bleed," Jackson swore. "I'll pay you back for their lives." "My terms are more specific than that." Eleanor's voice was as cold and clear as ice. She rose and stood before him, her hands clasped, her pregnant belly a stark silhouette against the firelight. "My husband, James, died a year ago. He left me this land, this legacy, but he did not leave me an heir." She paused, letting the words settle. "I have since discovered that I am barren. The child I carry is not my own. It is my sister's, and she died in childbirth. I will raise it as my own, but it will not carry the Hayes name forward." Jackson stared at her, a cold dread beginning to seep into his bones. He did not understand where this was going, but he knew it was a place of darkness. "This estate, by the terms of my husband's will, must pass to a blood heir," she continued, her voice devoid of all emotion. "Without one, it will be broken up and sold upon my death. Everything he built will turn to dust." She finally met his gaze, her dark eyes holding his with an intensity that was terrifying. "You are a strong, healthy man. You have sired 2 sons. Your debt to me is not for labor, Mr. Blackwood. It is for life itself. And the price is a child." The air left Jackson's lungs. "What?" "You will provide me with an heir," she stated, as if discussing the purchase of livestock. "A child of my husband's bloodline. In spirit if not in fact. A child to inherit this land. That is the bargain. That is the price for your freedom and for the lives and safety of your sons. When I hold a healthy infant in my arms, your indenture will be terminated. You and your boys will be free to go." The proposition was so monstrous, so fundamentally violating, that Jackson could not form a response. It was a cold, calculated breeding arrangement. He was to be a stud, a means to an end. The memory of his wife, Sarah, rose in his mind, her warm smile, her gentle touch. This was an ultimate betrayal of that love. As he reeled from the shock, his gaze fell upon a polished wooden case on the mantelpiece. It was a medical case, old but well cared for. "Your husband," he began, his voice hoarse. "Was he a doctor?" "He was," Eleanor confirmed. "A very fine one." "May I?" Jackson asked, moving toward the case, needing a distraction, something tangible to grasp in a world that had just dissolved into madness. She gave a curt nod. He opened the case. Inside, nestled in worn velvet, lay a set of surgical tools. They were not the rough instruments of a frontier physician. They were fine, German steel, a surgeon's set, an amputation saw, scalpels, forceps of a specific design he knew intimately. He had used a set just like them on the battlefields of the Civil War. They were the tools of a man who had seen the worst of what men could do to each other. His blood ran cold. The man who owned these tools was no simple country doctor. He was a battlefield surgeon. "I am Dr. Nathan Blackwood," he said, the words falling from his lips before he could stop them. His old life, his true identity, confessed in a moment of profound shock. Eleanor's expression did not change, but a flicker of something, recognition, confirmation, passed through her eyes. "I know," she said softly. Then, watching the dawning horror and confusion on his face, she delivered the final, devastating blow. "I know everything about you, Doctor. That is why I chose you." The cold bargain had been struck, but its foundation, Jackson now realized, was built on secrets far deeper and more terrifying than he could have ever imagined. He was not just a random thief she had saved from the gallows. He was a chosen man, chosen for a purpose that was now terrifyingly clear, by a woman who knew the ghosts he had been running from for 3 long years. He looked at the door to the room where his son slept, safe and warm for the first time in months. He was trapped, utterly and completely trapped. He gave a single, defeated nod. The days that followed were a suffocating routine of labor and silence. Nathan, he could not think of himself as Jackson anymore, felt his identity being stripped away with every swing of the axe, every furrow he plowed in Eleanor's vast, empty fields. He was no longer a doctor, a husband, or even a fugitive. He was a tool, a breeding animal, his purpose reduced to the most primal, mechanical function. He worked from dawn until dusk, pushing his body to the point of exhaustion, hoping the physical pain would numb the searing shame in his soul. His interactions with Eleanor were clinical, brief exchanges about the day's chores or the boy's needs. The monstrous bargain was a chasm between them, an unacknowledged truth that poisoned the air. The presence of his sons was a constant, twisting agony. Their laughter, their simple joy at having full bellies and a warm bed, was the very reason he had agreed to this damnation. He was saving them by sacrificing the last vestiges of himself. The house remained a silent, sterile prison. The boys, sensing the oppressive grief that clung to the walls, learned to play in hushed tones. Their vibrant life force was a stark contrast to the house's cold, ordered stillness, and Nathan could see it wore on Eleanor. She watched them with a strange, conflicted expression, a mixture of longing and a pain so profound it seemed to suck the warmth from the room. The first sign of trouble was a small, dry cough from Daniel. Nathan dismissed it as dust from the hayloft, but by the next day, it had deepened. A fever set in that evening, and as Nathan carried his son to bed, he felt the unnatural heat of the boy's skin and heard the faint, wheezing rattle in his chest. Outside, the sky had turned a bruised, angry gray, and the wind began to howl, a low, mournful sound that seemed to creep through the cabin walls. The storm was coming. By midnight, it was a full-blown blizzard, and Daniel was struggling for every breath. His small body was slick with sweat, his lips tinged with a bluish hue that sent a spike of pure terror through Nathan's heart. He was watching his son die, and all his years of medical training were useless, a ghost limb he could no longer command. Eleanor, drawn by the sound of Daniel's labored breathing, appeared in the doorway. The icy composure she maintained like a shield had shattered. Her face was a mask of raw fear and something else, a fierce, focused urgency. "Pneumonia," she said, her voice sharp with a knowledge that went beyond simple frontier remedies. "We need to get the fever down and clear his lungs." She moved with a desperate, skilled efficiency that stunned him. She sent Nathan for mustard and flour to make a poultice, directed him to boil willow bark for tea, and began propping Daniel up with pillows in a specific way to ease the strain on his lungs. Her hands were steady, her instructions precise. She was not a grieving widow. She was a clinician in the midst of a crisis. They worked together through the long, terrifying hours, the storm raging outside in a symphony of their own private hell. But Daniel only grew worse. His breathing became a shallow, ragged gasp, a terrible sucking sound that signaled his lungs were filling with fluid. Then the sound stopped. In the sudden, horrifying silence, Nathan saw his son's chest go still. "He's not breathing," Eleanor whispered, her voice breaking. In that instant, the ghost limb became real. The doctor, the surgeon Nathan had buried for 3 years, surged to the surface. He was no longer a fugitive or a prisoner. He was a father, and he would not let his son go. "The knife," he commanded, his voice ringing with an authority that made Eleanor jump. From the medical case. Now, she didn't question him. She ran to the mantel, retrieved the case, and brought it to the bed. Nathan's hands were rock steady as he selected a thin, sharp scalpel. He tore open Daniel's small shirt, felt for the hollow at the base of his throat, and without a second of hesitation, made a small, precise incision. Eleanor gasped, her hand flying to her mouth, but she didn't interfere. She watched, her eyes wide with a dawning, horrified recognition as he inserted the hollow shaft of a goose quill into the opening. He lowered his head and breathed into the quill. Once, twice. Daniel's small chest rose, then fell. Nathan breathed again, and this time, a small, wet cough rattled the boy's frame. A choked, gurgling breath followed, then another. The bluish tint began to recede from his lips. They worked side by side for the rest of the night, their pretenses stripped away by the raw immediacy of life and death. The storm outside began to subside as dawn approached, and with it, Daniel's fever finally broke. He was breathing shallowly, but steadily, through the quill, his color returning to a pale but natural hue. Exhausted, they sat in the quiet, gray light of the new day, watching the gentle rise and fall of Daniel's chest. The air was thick with unspoken truths. "You are no thief," Eleanor said finally, her voice a raw whisper. Nathan ran a hand over his face, the surgeon's adrenaline fading, leaving behind a bone-deep weariness. "No," he said, "I am Dr. Nathan Blackwood." "A fugitive?" Eleanor's gaze was fixed on his face, her expression a complex mixture of awe and sorrow. "My husband, James. The riding accident was a lie. He was a doctor, too. A fine one. He lost a child patient, the daughter of a powerful man. The lawsuit that followed ruined him. He couldn't bear the shame." Her voice broke. "He took his own life." The confession hung in the air between them, a bridge of shared, professional tragedy. Both healers, both broken by a past they could not escape. They were not owner and property. They were peers, fugitives from the ghosts of their former lives, now bound by the life of a child they had saved together. As the first rays of sun broke through the clouds, casting a pale, hopeful light into the room, Nathan looked at Eleanor. The cold, calculating woman from the gallows was gone, replaced by a grieving widow whose strength was forged in a crucible of pain he now understood all too well. And the bargain, their monstrous, cold bargain, now seemed like a fever dream. How could she hold him to such a contract? How could he possibly fulfill it? The storm had passed, but it had left their world irrevocably changed. Daniel was safe, but Nathan and Eleanor were now adrift in a new, terrifyingly intimate reality, with the shadow of their impossible promise hanging over them, darker and more threatening than ever before. A fragile peace settled over the homestead in the weeks following the storm. The blizzard had broken more than just the fever. It had shattered the walls of silence and shame that had held them captive. The cold bargain, their monstrous contract, was now a ghost in the house, an awkward, unspoken presence, but no longer the defining truth of their existence. The rigid routine softened into a quiet partnership. They were no longer owner and indentured servant, but two survivors learning to navigate the geography of each other's grief. Nathan found himself talking, truly talking, for the first time in years. As they mended fences under a pale spring sun, he spoke of Sarah, his late wife, describing the warmth of her smile and the fierce intelligence in her eyes. He told Eleanor of the terrible night that had sent him running, of the struggle with Judge Reynolds' son, a young man maddened by a laudanum addiction born on a battlefield, of the accidental death that had been twisted into a narrative of murder by a powerful, grieving father. Eleanor, in turn, began to fill in the empty spaces of her own story. She spoke of James, her late husband, not as the failure who had taken his own life, but as the passionate, brilliant doctor he had been. She revealed his torment came not just from one lost patient, but from the relentless pressure of a powerful mentor, a man who demanded perfection and offered no mercy for human error. He was a titan in the legal world, a man James once admired above all others, she explained one evening as they sat by the fire, the boys sleeping soundly. But his influence became a poison. He destroyed my husband's confidence, then his reputation. This tentative sharing of histories was the soil in which a new trust began to grow. Nathan saw the fierce loyalty and deep love Eleanor still held for James. She saw the profound integrity that had forced Nathan to flee rather than live under a lie. The most significant change, however, came from Matthew. The boy had watched Eleanor with cautious, assessing eyes since the night of the storm. He had seen her work alongside his father, her hands as steady, her resolve as fierce. One afternoon, he found her in the main room, reading from one of James's heavy medical texts. He stood in the doorway for a long moment before speaking, his small voice barely a whisper. "Can you teach me?" he asked, nodding toward the book. "The words," Pa says a man needs his letters. Tears pricked at Eleanor's eyes. This small, serious boy, who had been forced to become a man too soon, was offering her the one thing she had never expected to receive, a child's trust. She patted the stool beside her. "I would be honored, Matthew," she said, her voice thick with emotion. Their lessons became a daily ritual, a quiet island of peace in their uncertain world. Matthew's quick mind absorbed the complex medical terms, his determination a mirror of his father's. Through him, Eleanor felt a part of her own broken heart begin to mend. The fragile peace was shattered on a bright, cloudless Tuesday. Preacher Ezekiel Reed rode up to the homestead, his face a mask of grim urgency. He dismounted before his horse had fully stopped. "Nathan," he called, his voice low but carrying a weight that made Nathan's blood run cold. "Trouble has found you." Eleanor came to the door, Matthew and Daniel peering from behind her skirts. "A stranger arrived in Redemption yesterday," the preacher said, wasting no time. "A man of wealth and influence, asking questions. He's staying at the hotel, and he's made no secret of his purpose." Reed's eyes, full of sorrow and pity, met Nathan's. "His name is Judge Maxwell Reynolds." The name struck Nathan like a physical blow. The world tilted, the years of running collapsing into a single, terrifying moment. He was found. The past he had outrun for 1,000 miles had finally caught him. His first instinct, primal and overwhelming, was to flee, to grab the boys, saddle the horse, and disappear back into the mountains, into the anonymous wilderness that had been his only sanctuary. "No!" Eleanor's voice was quiet but unshakable. She stepped onto the porch, her hand finding the small of his back, a simple touch that was both an anchor and a declaration. "No more running, Nathan. He'll destroy you for harboring me," Nathan said, his voice ragged. "He'll take the boys. You don't know what he's capable of." "Then it is time he learned what we are capable of," she countered, her gaze fierce. "This is our home now. We will not be driven from it by a ghost from your past." Preacher Reed cleared his throat, his expression deeply troubled. "There is more," he said, his gaze shifting to Eleanor. "And I fear this connects your ghosts as well, Mrs. Hayes." He hesitated, as if reluctant to speak the words. "Judge Reynolds? He was your husband's mentor, the powerful man who destroyed James's career." The revelation fell into the silence with the force of a landslide. Nathan and Eleanor stared at each other, the separate tragedies of their lives suddenly, impossibly, intertwined. It wasn't a coincidence. It was a conspiracy, a web of power and corruption spun by one man, a man who had destroyed one doctor and was now here to claim another. James hadn't just known of Judge Reynolds. He must have known a secret about the man, a dangerous secret that had led to his silence, and then his death. Nathan's instinct to flee died, replaced by a cold, rising anger. This was not just his fight anymore. It was Eleanor's. It was for the memory of James Hayes. He looked from Eleanor's determined face to the preacher's grim one, and then to his sons, who stood watching, their young faces reflecting the fear and resolve of their parents. He had run for 3 years to protect them, but now, he saw with blinding clarity, the most courageous act of protection was not to run, but to stand his ground. "He came here looking for a fugitive thief named Jackson Blackwood," Nathan said, his voice low and steady, the surgeon's calm returning in the face of a new, more dangerous diagnosis. "It's time he met Dr. Nathan Blackwood." Eleanor's hand squeezed his back, a silent affirmation of their new, unbreakable alliance. The cold bargain for an heir was dead and buried. In its place, something far more powerful had been forged, a family, bound not by contract, but by a shared resolve to face the coming darkness together. The homestead transformed. In the 2 days that followed Preacher Reed's warning, the farm ceased to be a place of healing and became a fortress. The air, once filled with the tentative sounds of a new family forming, now crackled with the tense, quiet energy of a garrison preparing for a siege. Nathan's past life as a soldier took command. He saw the land not in terms of furrows and pastures, but of sightlines and fields of fire. Eleanor, with her intimate knowledge of every dip in the terrain and every sturdy oak, became his second in command. They boarded the lower windows, leaving only small slits for observation and defense. They moved barrels of water into the house, filled every lamp with oil, and stacked sacks of flour and grain against the inside of the main door to act as a bulwark. The boys, wide-eyed but resolute, became part of the effort. Matthew, with his solemn focus, was tasked with keeping the wood boxes full. Daniel, smaller and quicker, became a scout between the house and the barn, his small form less likely to draw attention. They were a unit, a family bound by a common, approaching threat. The threat arrived on the third day, not as an armed assault, but in the form of the law. Sheriff Holt rode up alone, his face a mask of miserable conflict. He dismounted slowly, his hand hovering near his pistol, a gesture Nathan recognized as the unease of a man about to betray his own conscience. Eleanor met him on the porch, Nathan standing just inside the doorway, his shotgun held loosely at his side. "Eleanor," the sheriff began, unable to meet her gaze, "I have a warrant for the arrest of one Nathan Blackwood on charges of murder, issued by the authority of Territorial Judge Maxwell Reynolds." "And you intend to serve it, Thomas?" Eleanor's voice was cold, devoid of the neighborly warmth she usually showed him. "I have no choice," Holt muttered, finally looking up. His eyes were pleading. "Reynolds has the backing of the governor. He's turning the town against you. Folks are scared. He's calling Nathan a monster. You a fallen woman." He held out the paper. "He says if I don't bring him in by tomorrow, he'll have me removed and deputize his own men." "And you believe the lies he's telling?" Nathan asked from the doorway. "I believe I'm trapped," Holt admitted, his voice cracking. "But I can give you time. He expects me to return with a posse at noon tomorrow. That's 24 hours. He looked from Nathan to Eleanor. "Whatever you're going to do it fast." With that, he turned, mounted his horse, and rode away, a man fleeing a battle he had already lost in his own soul. The intimidation began that evening. Two riders appeared on the ridge overlooking the homestead, their figures stark silhouettes against the setting sun. They didn't approach, just watched, a silent, menacing promise of what was to come. Later that night, Nathan found one of their chickens dead by the well, its neck broken. A clear message: "We can get to you, we can poison your water, we can starve you out." The siege had begun. They spent the night in a state of high alert, taking turns on watch. The house was dark, save for the low glow of a single, shielded lamp. In those quiet, terrifying hours, with the weight of their imminent doom pressing in, the last of their pretenses fell away. Nathan found Eleanor by the window, staring out at the darkness where the sentinels had been. He came and stood beside her, their shoulders brushing. The simple contact was an anchor in the swirling fear. "I'm sorry for this," he said, his voice a low murmur. "I brought this to your door." "You brought life back to this house," she corrected softly. "Before you came, it was a tomb. I was just a caretaker for a ghost." She turned to face him, her eyes luminous in the dim light. "I would rather face this with you, Nathan, than face the silence alone again." The raw honesty in her voice broke through the last of his defenses. The cold bargain, the shame, the years of running, it all fell away, leaving only the profound, undeniable truth. "The bargain is dead, Eleanor," he said, his voice thick with emotion. He took her hands, his grip gentle but firm. "But the promise to give you a child, that one I intend to keep." He saw the confusion in her eyes and clarified, the words of vow spoken in the shadow of death. "As my husband, if we survive this, Eleanor Hayes, I want you to be my wife. I want Matthew and Daniel to be your sons." Tears welled in her eyes, spilling silently down her cheeks. She didn't answer with words. She simply leaned forward and kissed him, a kiss that was not of passion, but of profound, aching tenderness, a sealing of a new covenant, a vow of a shared future in a world that seemed determined to deny them one. It was later, while searching for extra blankets in a large cedar chest at the foot of her bed, a chest she hadn't opened since James's death, that she found it. Tucked beneath her husband's folded university robes was a small, leather-bound journal she had never seen before. Her hands trembled as she opened it. The first entry was dated 2 years before his death. "Judge Reynolds has written again. His questions about the Abernathy case become more pointed. He knows I suspect the truth, but he cannot know that I have proof." Eleanor's blood ran cold. She carried the journal to the lamp, her heart pounding. She read on, the pages filled with James's neat, clinical script, a secret history of his own torment. The story that unfolded was more devastating than she could have imagined. Judge Reynolds' son hadn't died from a surgical complication. He had died from an overdose of laudanum, an addict who had begged James to supply him. James had refused, and the boy had taken his own life in a fit of despair. Reynolds, a man obsessed with his family's perfect reputation, had buried the truth. To ensure James's silence, he had fabricated the malpractice claim, using his immense influence to destroy James's career and reputation, threatening him until the weight of the secret and the shame became too much to bear. The journal was the proof. It contained names, dates, even a copy of a letter from the coroner that Reynolds had suppressed. "Nathan," she whispered, her voice shaking. He came to her side, and together they read the final, damning entry. "He has won. I cannot fight him any longer. My name is destroyed, and he has threatened Eleanor should I ever speak the truth. I will take the coward's way out, but I cannot take this proof with me. I leave this journal as my only testimony. May God have mercy on my soul, and may he one day deliver this truth into the hands of someone strong enough to see justice done." They had it, the weapon that could destroy Reynolds, the truth that could set them all free, but they were trapped, prisoners in their own home, surrounded by the judge's men. Nathan looked out the window. The eastern sky was beginning to pale. In the gray, pre-dawn light, he could see them gathering at the edge of the property. More men now, at least a half dozen, their forms moving with grim purpose. The final assault was coming with the sunrise. He turned back to Eleanor, who stood with the journal clutched to her chest, her face a mixture of vindicated grief and terror. He pulled her close, his arms a protective circle around her and the new life she carried. "Whatever happens," he murmured into her hair, "we face it together." Outside, a man shouted an order. The siege was about to end. The battle for their lives was about to begin. Dawn broke, a sliver of bloody orange on the horizon. The air was cold and still, holding its breath before the coming violence. Inside the cabin, Nathan and Eleanor shared what they believed might be their final moments. He held her close, the leather of James's journal a tangible presence between them, a testament to a battle they might not live to win. "I love you," he whispered, the words of final, desperate truth in the face of death. "I love you, too," she answered, her voice steady, a beacon in the terrifying quiet. The first shot shattered the silence and a window pane, sending a spray of glass across the floor. The assault had begun, but just as the attackers started their advance, a sound, faint at first, then growing louder, cut through the morning air. It was a sound that had no place in the grim calculus of the siege, the insistent, clamorous ringing of a church bell. It pealed again and again, not a gentle call to worship, but a frantic, urgent alarm. The men outside hesitated, their advance faltering as they looked toward the town. The bell of Redemption's only church was reserved for dire emergencies. Fire, flood, or an imminent attack. "What is that?" Eleanor breathed, her and Nathan exchanging a look of stunned confusion. Then they saw him. Matthew, their small, serious Matthew, who had become a ghost in the pre-dawn darkness. He had slipped out not through a door or window, but through a small, forgotten root cellar hatch hidden beneath a rug, a route he had discovered in his quiet explorations. He hadn't run for the mountains. He had run for the town, for the one man his father had, in their brief, desperate lessons, taught him was a last resort, the preacher. On the steps of the church, his face illuminated by the rising sun, preacher Ezekiel Reed was not delivering a sermon. He was holding a trial. In one hand, he held his Bible, and in the other, James Hayes's journal. His voice, amplified by the righteous fury of a man of God who had seen too much injustice, boomed across the town square. "Judge Reynolds told you this man was a murderer," Reed roared, his voice echoing off the silent storefronts as the townsfolk began to emerge, drawn by the bell. "He told you this woman was a harlot, but I hold in my hand the testimony of a good man this judge drove to his grave. I hold the truth of a crime not of passion, but of pride." He read from the journal, his voice ringing with the power of James's damning words. He told the story of a father's shame, a doctor's destruction, and a conspiracy of silence. Back at the homestead, the effect was immediate. The attackers, hired men with no loyalty beyond their pay, were now caught between their orders and the undeniable sound of a town rising against their employer. It was Sheriff Holt who led them, a man redeemed, He rode at the head of a posse not of deputies, but of his neighbors, farmers and shopkeepers, men who had been cowed by Reynolds's power but were no longer willing to stand by. They were armed with hunting rifles and shotguns, their faces set with a grim, reluctant determination. The firefight was fierce but blessedly brief. The hired guns, their morale broken by the arrival of the posse, quickly surrendered or fled into the wilderness. In the midst of the chaos, Judge Reynolds, who had been directing the assault from a safe distance, saw his power evaporate. His face a mask of disbelief and rage. He spurred his horse forward, breaking from the trees in a final, desperate charge. His pistol aimed not at the posse, but directly at Nathan. He fired. The world seemed to slow. Nathan saw the flash, heard the crack, but before the bullet could find its mark, another report, sharper and closer, answered it. Eleanor stood on the porch, James's heavy hunting rifle steady in her hands, a thin tendril of smoke curling from the barrel. Reynolds cried out, clutching his shoulder as his horse reared, throwing him to the ground. He lay there, a broken, defeated man, his reign of terror ended by the woman whose life he had so carelessly destroyed. It was not an act of vengeance, but of fierce, protective love. In that single, decisive moment, Eleanor Hayes had not only saved the man she loved, but had finally, truly, laid her husband's ghost to rest. 1 year later, the homestead was a place reborn. The fields were plowed, the fences were mended, and the house, once a silent tomb, was filled with the sounds of life. Nathan Blackwood, his name cleared by a federal investigation that had exposed the depth of Reynolds's corruption, now served as redemption's doctor, his skills a gift to the community that had, in the end, saved him. Eleanor stood on the porch, her hand resting on her gently rounded belly, a visible promise of the new life they had forged together. She watched as Nathan knelt in the yard, showing Matthew how to properly set a splint on a small wooden bird with a broken wing. Daniel, his face beaming, ran toward them from the barn, a basket of freshly gathered eggs held carefully in his small hands. This was their legacy, not the cold, empty estate James had tried to preserve, but this, a bustling, loving, chaotic home. The cold bargain, the monstrous contract that had brought them together, had been transformed by fire and faith into something sacred. Preacher Reed, a frequent visitor, sat in the rocking chair, a cup of Eleanor's coffee in his hand. "The land is a good teacher," he observed, his eyes twinkling. "It shows us that even after the harshest winter, life finds a way to begin again." Nathan looked up, his gaze meeting Eleanor's across the yard. His smile was full of a peace she had once thought impossible. He had found his own redemption, not in running from his past, but in building a future. They were a family, forged in desperation, bound by secrets, and finally, blessedly, freed by love. The land was theirs, not by inheritance or contract, but because they had defended it, healed it, and filled it with hope. Their sons would grow up here, strong and true, and soon, a new child would be born, a child of the promise, an heir not just to a piece of land, but to a legacy of courage, resilience, and the enduring power of a family chosen.